The air in Winterridge smelled of cinnamon, pine, and the faintest hint of snow. Lights strung from rooftops and lampposts bathed the streets in a warm glow, flickering like a million tiny stars. The annual Christmas festival was in full swing, with carolers singing near the town square and children laughing as they skated on the temporary ice rink. Every shop window displayed elaborate decorations. A toy store showcased a mechanical Santa handing out gifts, while the bakery across the street had a mountain of sugar-dusted pastries beneath a sign that read, "Warm your heart here." For most of the town, Winterridge felt like a living Christmas card. But for Eleanor Hartfield, it was simply another place to avoid meaningful connection. Eleanor's large colonial-style mansion stood on a hill overlooking the town, its windows dark, save for the dim light from her office. Inside, the room was sterile, lined with shelves of books she rarely read anymore. Eleanor sat at her desk, skimming emails, her manicured fingers typing replies without hesitation. A small glass of whiskey sat untouched beside her. Her assistant, Janine, stood in the doorway, holding a thick stack of envelopes wrapped with a red ribbon. "Miss Hartfield," Janine began cautiously, "these are the letters from the charity drive. We've already sorted through most of them. Would you like to pick one to sponsor personally, as you did last year?" Eleanor sighed, her sharp blue eyes scanning the pile as if it were a chore. "Isn't the point of a donation to handle this automatically?" she replied, her voice clipped. "Why pretend I'm personally involved?" "Well, it's become something of a tradition," Janine said with a strained smile. "People love knowing the Hartfield Foundation is behind the Christmas miracles in this town." Eleanor waved a dismissive hand. "Leave them. I'll look later." Janine hesitated. "Maybe a little inspiration wouldn't hurt," she said softly before setting the stack on the desk and slipping out of the room. Hours passed, and the letters remained untouched. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes. Eleanor glanced at the stack and frowned. With a reluctant sigh, she untied the ribbon and picked up the first letter. It was written on lined notebook paper, the handwriting uneven and clumsy, but filled with an earnestness she hadn't expected. "Dear Santa, I know this is a silly letter, but my sister Mia and I think maybe you'll read it because we don't have anyone else to ask. I'm Ollie, and I'm 10. My sister is 6. We live in the shelter now. It's not so bad, but it's not like home. I'm trying to be brave for Mia, but sometimes I feel really scared. For Christmas, I don't need toys or anything like that. I just want Mia to have her own bed again, like she used to, and a place where she doesn't have to worry. And maybe, if it's not too much, I could have something too, a family that won't go away. I hope you're real, Santa. If you are, thanks for listening. Love, Ollie." Eleanor stared at the paper, reading the lines over again. The words tugged at something deep within her, something she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't pity exactly, it was more like recognition. She thought of her own childhood, the fleeting moments of warmth before everything unraveled. Folding the letter carefully, she placed it back on her desk. For the first time in what felt like ages, Eleanor left her office before midnight. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, she carried Ollie's words with her. The next morning, as the town bustled with holiday cheer, Eleanor prepared for another day of meetings and phone calls. But something felt different. Her gaze kept drifting to the letter, now sitting prominently on her desk. It seemed to challenge her, daring her to respond. By late afternoon, the decision was made. Eleanor wrapped herself in a wool coat and scarf, the chill of the season biting at her as she stepped outside. Janine looked up in surprise as Eleanor strode toward her. "Find out where that letter came from," Eleanor said, holding up Ollie's note. "I want to meet the boy who wrote this." Janine blinked. "Are you sure, Miss Hartfield?" "It's not exactly." "I'm sure," Eleanor interrupted. Her tone was firm, though her heart raced. "Let's make it happen." As Eleanor's car pulled out of the driveway and began the descent into town, she glanced at the skyline of Winterridge. The lights glittered like beacons against the growing twilight. For the first time in years, she wasn't entirely sure what she was doing, or why. All she knew was that something about Ollie's words had reached her in a way she couldn't ignore. And though she would never admit it, she felt a flicker of hope, fragile but unmistakable, lighting a corner of her heart. The Winteridge Community Shelter sat on the edge of town, a modest brick building adorned with a few strings of lights that struggled to compete with the dazzling displays elsewhere. Inside, the atmosphere was warm but chaotic. Volunteers bustled about, serving hot meals and distributing donated winter coats, while children's laughter and the occasional cry echoed through the main hall. Ollie sat cross-legged on a threadbare rug near a corner, his fingers gripping a dull pencil as he sketched in a notebook. His sister, Mia, leaned against him, her tiny frame wrapped in a mismatched sweater and scarf that were 2 sizes too big. She stared intently at his drawing, her face lighting up with delight. "What is it this time?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A castle," Ollie replied, tilting the notebook toward her. "It's where we're gonna live one day. You get your own room, see? And look, there's a swing in the backyard." Mia's eyes widened as she traced the outline of the swing with her finger. "Do I get my own bed too?" "Of course," Ollie said with a grin, though his heart ached. "The biggest one you've ever seen." Mia giggled, her faith in his words absolute. For her, Ollie's drawings were promises, not fantasies. Across the room, the shelter's director, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes named Mrs. Foster, greeted Eleanor as she stepped inside. The contrast between Eleanor's tailored coat and the humble surroundings was stark, and her presence drew curious glances from volunteers and residents alike. She straightened her posture, clutching Ollie's letter in her gloved hand. "Miss Hartfield, welcome," Mrs. Foster said, her voice tinged with surprise. "I must admit, we weren't expecting someone like you." "I read this," Eleanor said, holding up the letter. "The boy who wrote it, Ollie. I'd like to meet him." Mrs. Foster's expression softened. "Ollie's a special one. Smart as a whip, too. He's over there with his sister." She gestured toward the corner where the siblings sat. Eleanor followed her gaze and spotted the 2 children. They were so absorbed in their own world that they didn't notice her approach at first. Ollie, his face pale but bright with determination, glanced up as she stopped in front of him. His pencil stilled. "Are you Ollie?" Eleanor asked, her tone unintentionally brisk. He nodded, his eyes wary but curious. "Yes, ma'am. Who are you?" She hesitated, unsure how to explain herself. "I read your letter." His eyes widened, and he sat up straighter. "You did? Did Santa send you?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. "Not exactly. I'm Eleanor Hartfield." I wanted to meet you." Ollie's gaze darted to Mia, then back to Eleanor. "Are you from the shelter? Or are you here to help us?" The directness of his question left her momentarily speechless. "I'm not with the shelter," she admitted, "but I wanted to know more about you and your sister." "About what you wrote." Ollie exchanged a quick look with Mia, who remained silent, her wide eyes fixed on Eleanor. The boy straightened his shoulders, trying to appear older than his years. "Well," he began, his voice steady, "Mia and I don't really have anyone else. Mom left a while ago, and they said she might come back, but—" His voice faltered, and he swallowed hard. "She hasn't." Eleanor's chest tightened. She'd known the letter hinted at a difficult situation, but hearing the words directly from Ollie made it painfully real. "That must be hard," she said, her voice softer now. Ollie nodded. "But we're okay. I take care of Mia, and sometimes, when she's scared, I tell her stories. Like the one about the castle." "The castle?" Eleanor asked, intrigued. Ollie reached for his notebook and flipped through the pages until he found his sketch. He held it up, showing her the castle he'd drawn. It was crude but imaginative, complete with towers, flags, and a sprawling yard. "This is where we'll live one day. It's gonna be safe and warm, and no one can ever make us leave." Mia tugged at Ollie's sleeve. "And I get my own bed," she whispered. "That's right," Ollie assured her with a smile. Eleanor stared at the drawing, feeling a lump rise in her throat. The simplicity of their dreams, a bed, a safe place to belong, struck her deeply. She thought of her own home, cold and empty despite its grandeur, and felt a pang of shame. "Why did you write the letter?" she asked, directing her question to Ollie. He hesitated, then shrugged. "I guess I thought maybe someone would listen. Someone who could make things better." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, Eleanor felt as though he could see right through her. His gaze wasn't pleading or desperate. It was hopeful. And that hope was what unsettled her most. Mrs. Foster reappeared then, breaking the moment. "Miss Hartfield, thank you for coming. I hope you see why Ollie's letter touched so many of us." Eleanor nodded absently, her thoughts awhirl. She turned back to Ollie. "I need some time to think, but I'll be back." Ollie tilted his head, studying her. "You promise?" It was a simple question, but the weight of it was immense. Eleanor hesitated, then said, "I promise." As she left the shelter, the wind nipped at her face, but she barely felt it. The image of Ollie's castle lingered in her mind, along with the quiet trust in his voice when he asked for a promise. For reasons she couldn't yet name, Eleanor felt something stir inside her, something long buried but still alive, a flicker of responsibility, of purpose. Driving back to her mansion, she glanced at the distant lights of the town below. Winteridge sparkled, a postcard-perfect image of holiday cheer. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, it felt like it held a question she couldn't ignore. What was she going to do next? Eleanor's car idled in her driveway, its headlights casting long shadows against the snow-covered shrubs that lined the entrance to her sprawling mansion. She didn't immediately step out. Instead, she sat gripping the steering wheel, her thoughts swirling around the boy she had just met. Ollie's face, equal parts guarded and hopeful, was etched in her mind. His words echoed in her ears, "You promise?" For someone who prided herself on control, Eleanor felt utterly lost. The safe, predictable world she had built for herself seemed almost laughable in contrast to the boy's reality. She'd avoided entanglements for so long, kept everyone at arm's length, even Rachel, her own daughter. And yet, here she was, unable to shake the feeling that Ollie's letter had been meant for her, not Santa Claus. Inside, the house was quiet as usual. Eleanor shrugged off her coat and walked toward her office. Her heels clicked against the polished hardwood floors, the sound amplified in the cavernous space. She poured herself a glass of wine, but didn't drink it. Instead, she stared at her desk, where Ollie's letter now sat alongside the sketch of his castle. She picked up the drawing and traced her finger over its pencil lines, marveling at the childlike ambition behind it. She could hear Janine's voice in her head. "People love knowing the Hartfield Foundation is behind the Christmas miracles in this town." But this wasn't about a tax-deductible donation or a photo op. This felt different. It felt personal. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her gaze falling on a framed photo on the corner of her desk. It was a picture of her family from decades ago. Her parents stood behind her and her brother, William, who was only 9 at the time. Eleanor was a teenager then, awkward and brimming with resentment over having to care for a little brother while their parents were often too busy. She hadn't thought about William in years, not really. But meeting Ollie had stirred memories she hadn't dared revisit. The boy's determination reminded her of William, how he used to scribble in his sketchpad, dreaming up inventions or fantastical worlds. But William had disappeared one day, just gone. Eleanor had always blamed herself for not looking harder, for not pressing their parents to do more. It was easier to bury the guilt and move on than to confront the ache of losing him. Now, decades later, a boy named Ollie had reignited that ache. But with it came a question. Was this a chance to do something right? To make up for what she couldn't do back then? The next morning, Eleanor made a call. She asked Janine to reschedule her meetings for the day and drove back to the shelter. This time, she brought with her a small box, its contents chosen after hours of deliberation the night before. When she arrived, Mrs. Foster greeted her warmly. "Back so soon?" the woman asked, raising an eyebrow. "I'd like to spend some more time with Ollie and Mia," Eleanor said, her tone more resolute than she felt. "If they're up for it." Mrs. Foster nodded. "They'll be thrilled. Ollie's been talking about you non-stop since you left." Eleanor wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but she followed Mrs. Foster into the common area. Ollie and Mia were sitting at the same corner table as before, but this time, Mia was coloring while Ollie sorted through a small stack of books he had borrowed from the shelter's modest library. When he saw Eleanor, his face lit up. "You came back!" he exclaimed, scrambling to his feet. "I told you I would." Eleanor replied, her lips curving into a hesitant smile. And I brought something for you. She handed him the box. Inside was a new sketch pad, a set of colored pencils, and a small book on drawing techniques. Ollie's eyes went wide as he opened it, carefully lifting each item as though they were made of gold. This is amazing, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. Mia peeked into the box, her small face lighting up. Ollie, look. Now you can draw in color. Eleanor felt an unexpected warmth bloom in her chest. I thought you might like something a little more permanent than notebook paper, she said. Ollie looked up at her, his expression earnest. This is the best thing anyone's ever given me. Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat suddenly tight. You're welcome, she said softly. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of conversation. Ollie showed her some of his older drawings, while Mia clung to his side, chiming in with details about the stories he'd made up to go with them. Eleanor listened, asking questions and offering encouragement. For the first time in years, she felt connected to someone, outside her own carefully guarded world. But beneath the warmth of the moment, Eleanor couldn't ignore the lingering uncertainty. What could she truly offer these children? Was she equipped to be anything more than a passing presence in their lives? As the afternoon stretched on, Mrs. Foster approached Eleanor with a thoughtful expression. You've made quite an impression on them, she said. But I have to ask, what are you hoping to achieve here? Eleanor hesitated, searching for an answer. I don't know yet, she admitted. I feel like I'm supposed to do something. Mrs. Foster nodded knowingly. Sometimes, that's enough to start with. Driving home later, Eleanor replayed the day's events in her mind. She could still see the way Ollie's face lit up when he opened the box, the way Mia giggled as he explained one of his stories. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt a glimmer of purpose, fragile but undeniable. As she pulled into her driveway, the weight of her own doubt lingered. She didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in years, she was willing to try. And somehow, she knew that would make all the difference. The days following Eleanor's second visit to the shelter were filled with an unfamiliar energy. She found herself thinking about Ollie and Mia constantly, about their resilience, their optimism, and the weight they carried at such a young age. It was impossible to push them from her mind. Even her work, which usually consumed her every waking hour, felt less urgent, less satisfying. The meetings and endless emails seemed trivial in comparison to the simple joy on Ollie's face when he'd opened the box of pencils. Eleanor had never been one to dwell on emotions, but the boy's unwavering hope, despite everything, struck a chord deep within her. She started rereading his letter at night, the words pulling her back to memories of her own childhood and the brother she'd failed to protect. Each time she folded the letter away, she found herself wondering, was this a chance to make a different choice? By the end of the week, Eleanor decided to visit the shelter again. This time, she wanted to spend more time with the children, to understand what they needed and perhaps figure out what she could offer. The idea terrified her. What if she wasn't enough? What if her efforts only made things worse? But something inside her, a quiet, persistent voice, urged her forward. When she arrived, the shelter was quieter than usual. Mrs. Foster greeted her with a smile and led her to the back room, where Ollie and Mia were sitting together at a table covered in construction paper, glue, and glitter. They were making Christmas cards, their hands smudged with color and sparkles. Mia was the first to notice Eleanor. She broke into a wide grin and waved enthusiastically. "Hi, Miss Eleanor," she called out, her voice high and sweet. Eleanor waved back, a smile creeping onto her face. "Hello, Mia. What are you two working on?" "Cards for Santa," Mia replied proudly, holding up a glitter-covered piece of paper that read, "Thank you for helping my brother." Ollie looked up from his own card, his face lighting up when he saw Eleanor. "You're back," he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I told you I'd come," Eleanor said, stepping closer to the table. "What about you, Ollie? Are you writing to Santa again?" He shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "No, this one's it's for someone else." "Who?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. Ollie hesitated for a moment, then slid the card toward her. The front was simple, with a carefully drawn picture of a castle. Inside, the words read, "Thank you for giving me hope. Love, Ollie." Eleanor felt her breath catch. "This is for me?" she asked softly. Ollie nodded, his cheeks flushing pink. "You're the first person who ever really listened," he said. "It's nice to know someone cares." For a moment, Eleanor couldn't find the words. She stared at the card, the weight of his gratitude pressing against her chest. "Ollie, thank you. This means a lot to me." Mia tugged at Eleanor's sleeve, breaking the moment. "Are you going to help us make cards now?" she asked, her eyes wide with hope. Eleanor hesitated. The idea of sitting down and crafting felt foreign, almost absurd. But as she looked at Mia's eager face and Ollie's quiet, steady gaze, she found herself pulling out a chair. "I suppose I could try," she said. The next hour passed in a blur of scissors, glue, and laughter. Eleanor's attempts at crafting were clumsy at best, but Mia giggled every time she smeared glitter in the wrong place or accidentally tore the paper. Ollie, ever patient, offered tips on how to make the castle towers straighter or the stars brighter. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt a lightness she couldn't quite explain. She wasn't thinking about work or her endless responsibilities. She was simply there, present in the moment, sharing something simple and meaningful with two children who had already endured more than most. When they finished, Mrs. Foster brought over a tray of hot cocoa and cookies. The three of them sat together, sipping from mismatched mugs and admiring their handiwork. Eleanor looked at the cards spread out on the table, each one a testament to the creativity and resilience of the children who had made them. She couldn't help but feel a swell of pride for Ollie and Mia. "You're both very talented," she said, her voice warm. "I think Santa's going to love these." Mia beamed, swinging her legs under the table. "Do you think he'll write back?" "I think he just might," Eleanor said, smiling. Ollie studied her for a moment, his expression serious. "Do you believe in Santa, Miss Eleanor?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. She hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I believe in the spirit of Christmas," she said carefully, "in kindness and hope, and in people like you, Ollie." Ollie seemed to accept her answer, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's a good thing to believe in," he said. As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor found herself dreading the moment she would have to leave. Being with Ollie and Mia felt unexpectedly natural, like finding a piece of herself she hadn't realized was missing. But eventually, the time came to say goodbye. Mia hugged her tightly, her small arms wrapping around Eleanor's waist. "Are you coming back?" she asked, her voice muffled against Eleanor's coat. Eleanor crouched down to meet her gaze. "I'll be back soon," she promised. "And maybe we can make more cards together." Mia nodded, her smile bright. "Okay, I can't wait." Ollie walked her to the door, his steps measured and deliberate. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "It means a lot to both of us." Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice gentle. "It means a lot to me too, Ollie. I'll see you soon." Driving home that evening, Eleanor felt a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. She didn't know exactly what her role in Ollie and Mia's lives would be, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to turn away. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt the beginnings of something she thought she'd lost forever. A sense of purpose, of connection, and maybe even hope. The crisp air of winterage bit at Eleanor's cheeks as she stepped out of her car in front of the shelter for the fourth time that week. The late afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows across the snowy streets. With each visit, this once unfamiliar place was starting to feel oddly significant, as if it were slowly drawing her into its orbit. She carried with her a small, wrapped gift, a set of classic children's books she had ordered overnight after hearing Ollie mention how much he loved to read. It was a modest gesture, but Eleanor had begun to see the value in such things. For years, her contributions had always been impersonal, large checks signed without much thought. Now, every interaction with Ollie and Mia seemed to chip away at her carefully maintained distance, forcing her to consider what it meant to truly give. Inside the shelter, the energy was different today. A group of volunteers bustled about, setting up folding tables and hanging garlands in preparation for the annual holiday party. The scent of hot chocolate and freshly baked cookies filled the air, mingling with the sound of cheerful chatter and the occasional jingle of bells from the children's activities. Eleanor scanned the room, quickly spotting Ollie and Mia at a table near the back. Mia was carefully arranging small pine cones into a makeshift wreath, her tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated. Ollie sat beside her, hunched over a book, his brow furrowed in focus. The sight brought an unexpected warmth to Eleanor's chest. As she approached, Mia was the first to notice her. "Miss Eleanor," she exclaimed, her voice bright. She abandoned her project and ran to hug Eleanor's legs. Ollie looked up, his face breaking into a smile that was more subdued but no less genuine. "Hi," he said, setting the book aside. "Hi, Mia." "Hi, Ollie." Eleanor handed the gift bag to Mia, who clutched it excitedly. "I brought you both a little something. For us?" Mia asked, her eyes wide. Eleanor nodded. "Open it." Mia tore into the bag with a mix of eagerness and care, pulling out the neatly wrapped books. Ollie leaned closer as she revealed the covers, titles like The Chronicles of Narnia and The Secret Garden. "These are amazing," Ollie said softly, his fingers tracing the edge of one of the books. "Thank you." "You're welcome," Eleanor replied, her voice equally quiet. "I thought you might enjoy them." Mia flipped through one of the books, her small hands turning the pages with fascination. "Ollie can read them to me," she said brightly. "He's really good at stories." Eleanor smiled. "I believe that." The three of them settled into an easy rhythm as the holiday party began around them. Volunteers passed out treats, children giggled as they took turns trying to pin a star on a cardboard Christmas tree, and a small choir sang carols near the entrance. The atmosphere was warm and bustling, a stark contrast to the silence Eleanor often returned to in her own home. At one point, Mrs. Foster stopped by their table with a mug of cocoa for Eleanor. "I have to say, Miss Hartfield," she began with a knowing smile, "you've been spending quite a bit of time here. The kids adore you." "I've been enjoying it," Eleanor admitted. It was the truth, though it still felt strange to say aloud. "It's nice to be part of something." Mrs. Foster nodded, her expression softening. "You've made a difference for them, especially for Ollie. That boy doesn't trust easily, but he's opened up to you." Eleanor glanced at Ollie, who was busy showing Mia how to balance a candy cane on her nose. His laugh, quiet but genuine, reached her ears, and she felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Pride, perhaps, or maybe protectiveness. "What's going to happen to them?" Eleanor asked, her voice low. Mrs. Foster's smile faded slightly. "They're in a tough spot," she admitted. "We've been trying to locate their mother, but so far, nothing. And with how the system works," she trailed off, shaking her head. "It's hard to say." Eleanor's chest tightened. "What if no one steps in?" Mrs. Foster hesitated, studying Eleanor for a long moment. "Then they'll go into foster care, hopefully together, but there are no guarantees." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Eleanor looked back at Ollie and Mia, their laughter continuing as if unaware of the precarious future that awaited them. The thought of them being separated, or worse, losing the spark that made them who they were, was unbearable. Later that evening, as the party began to wind down and families trickled out into the snowy night, Ollie approached Eleanor with his usual cautious confidence. "Are you leaving now?" he asked. "Soon," Eleanor replied. "But I'll see you again." Ollie studied her, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Do you think—" He hesitated, then started again. "Do you think people get second chances? Like, if someone messed up before, can they still fix things?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. She wanted to ask what had prompted it, but instead, she nodded slowly. "I think everyone deserves a second chance," she said. "Sometimes, it just takes a little courage." Ollie seemed to consider this, then gave her a small smile. "That's what I thought," he said before turning to check on Mia. Driving home that night, Eleanor replayed his question in her mind. She thought about her own life, the choices she'd made, and the opportunities she'd let slip away, especially with her brother, William, and later, with Rachel. Her past mistakes weighed heavily on her, but perhaps Ollie was right. Maybe it wasn't too late to make things right. As she pulled into her driveway, the first snowflakes of the evening began to fall, dusting the darkened landscape with a soft glow. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt something stir deep inside her, a faint but undeniable sense of hope. Perhaps she wasn't just giving Ollie and Mia a chance. Perhaps they were giving her one too. The following week brought a flurry of activity to Winteridge as Christmas edged closer. The town square was alive with the hum of last-minute shoppers, the jingling of bells from street performers, and the steady rhythm of carols wafting through the chilly air. Eleanor moved among the crowds with purpose, clutching a neatly folded list in her gloved hand. Each item on it was a small gesture: a scarf for Mia, a winter jacket for Ollie, books and art supplies for both. But underlying her errands was something deeper: the growing certainty that she wanted to be more involved in their lives. Eleanor had spent her career orchestrating solutions for complex problems, yet this decision felt uniquely daunting. Could she truly take on the responsibility of caring for these children? Would she be enough for them? The questions haunted her, but she couldn't ignore the tug at her heart, a pull stronger than doubt. Her next visit to the shelter wasn't planned. On an impulse, she stopped by in the early evening, the sun dipping low and painting the sky in hues of gold and violet. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter than usual. Some of the children were playing in a corner while a few adults lingered near the kitchen, chatting softly. Mrs. Foster greeted her warmly and mentioned that Ollie and Mia were in the reading nook. Eleanor found them there, nestled on a worn couch with a stack of books between them. Ollie was reading aloud, his voice calm and steady, while Mia leaned against him, her thumb tucked in her mouth. The sight stopped Eleanor in her tracks. It was such a simple, tender moment, yet it carried a weight that left her breathless. When Ollie noticed her, he closed the book carefully and smiled. "Hi, Miss Eleanor. You came back." "Of course," she said, her smile soft. "I always do." Mia perked up, sliding off the couch and hurrying over to hug Eleanor's waist. "We missed you," she said, her voice muffled against Eleanor's coat. "I missed you too," Eleanor replied, crouching down to meet her gaze. "How about we spend some time together tonight? Would you like that?" Mia nodded enthusiastically, and even Ollie's reserved demeanor seemed to relax. They spent the evening playing games and talking about their favorite Christmas traditions, or, in Mia and Ollie's case, the traditions they dreamed of having one day. As the hours passed, Eleanor felt her connection to them deepen, the protective instinct inside her growing stronger. Later, as the children prepared for bed, Eleanor lingered near Mrs. Foster's office. The older woman motioned for her to step inside. "You've taken quite a shine to them," Mrs. Foster said gently, her perceptive eyes watching Eleanor closely. "I have," Eleanor admitted, folding her arms across her chest. "I can't explain it, but they feel like family." Mrs. Foster nodded, her expression softening. "That doesn't surprise me. You've been good for them. They trust you." Eleanor hesitated, then took a deep breath. "What would it take for me to take care of them? Permanently, I mean." Mrs. Foster leaned back in her chair, considering her carefully. "It's not an easy process," she said. "There's paperwork, home visits, assessments, and you'd need to be sure this is what you want. It's not just about providing for them financially. It's about being there for them every day." "I understand," Eleanor said, though her voice wavered slightly. "But I want to try. I think I could give them the home they deserve." Mrs. Foster smiled faintly. "Then I'll help you get started." The drive home was quiet, the usual noise in Eleanor's head replaced by a steady resolve. She thought about the path ahead, the challenges, the adjustments, the fears she would have to face. But she also thought about Ollie and Mia, and the joy they had brought into her life in such a short time. For the first time in years, she felt like she was moving towards something that truly mattered. The next morning, Eleanor reached out to Rachel. Their relationship had been strained for years, the distance between them as much emotional as physical. But if she was going to bring Ollie and Mia into her life, she knew she needed to try to repair that connection too. Rachel answered after a few rings, her tone polite but guarded. "Mom, this is unexpected." "I know," Eleanor said, her voice tinged with nerves. "I wanted to talk. It's been too long." There was a pause, then Rachel sighed. It has. What's on your mind? Eleanor hesitated, then began to tell her about Ollie and Mia. She described their situation, their resilience, and how they had slowly become a part of her life. As she spoke, she realized how much she wanted Rachel to understand, to see why this mattered so much. When she finished, Rachel was quiet for a long moment. You sound different, she said finally. Like you found something you care about. I think I have, Eleanor admitted. But I don't want to do this without you. I know I haven't been the mother you needed, Rachel, and I'm sorry for that. But I want to try to be better. For you and for them. Rachel's voice softened. I'll think about it. And I'd like to meet them. Eleanor's heart lifted. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start. As the days passed, Eleanor threw herself into the process of becoming a guardian for Ollie and Mia. She worked closely with Mrs. Foster, filling out forms, preparing her home, and learning what it would take to provide the stability the children needed. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, of fear that she wasn't up to the task. But every time she saw Ollie's quiet determination or Mia's bright smile, she found the strength to keep going. One evening, as she tucked Mia into bed at the shelter, the little girl reached up and touched Eleanor's hand. Are we gonna live with you? She asked, her voice small but hopeful. Eleanor's throat tightened. I hope so, Mia, she said. I'm doing everything I can to make it happen. Mia smiled, her eyes fluttering closed. I want that too. As Eleanor watched her drift off to sleep, she felt a quiet certainty settle over her. This wasn't just about giving Ollie and Mia a home. It was about finding one herself. And for the first time in years, Eleanor felt like she truly belonged. The snow fell steadily outside the shelter, blanketing Winteridge in a soft, glittering white. Eleanor stepped through the front doors with a carefully balanced tray of cookies and hot cocoa. It had been her idea to bring a small treat for the children and staff, though she hardly recognized herself in the gesture. The Eleanor of a few months ago would have considered it unnecessary, but now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Inside, the shelter was buzzing with quiet anticipation. Christmas was only a few days away, and the children were growing more excited with each passing moment. Mrs. Foster greeted Eleanor with her usual warmth and took the tray from her. They'll love this, she said. It's been a while since we've had anything homemade. I can't take credit for baking them, Eleanor admitted with a small smile. But I thought it might brighten the day. It will, Mrs. Foster assured her. They're in the art room. Go on in. Eleanor made her way down the familiar hall to the art room, where the sound of laughter and soft chatter spilled out through the open door. Inside, Ollie and Mia sat at a long table with a few other children, their heads bent over sheets of paper and jars of paint. Ollie was working on one of his intricate drawings, a winter scene with a castle perched on a hill. Mia, meanwhile, was smearing glitter glue across her page with unrestrained enthusiasm. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them. There was something about their ease, their quiet determination to create beauty despite their circumstances, that humbled her. She stepped into the room, and Mia immediately looked up, her face lighting up. Miss Eleanor. Ollie glanced over and offered her a small smile. Hi, he said simply, his tone as warm as the look in his eyes. Hi, you too, Eleanor replied, pulling out a chair to join them. What are you working on? Mia held up her glitter-coated paper proudly. It's a Christmas tree. See the star on top? It's beautiful, Eleanor said, marveling at the little girl's enthusiasm. And Ollie, is that another castle? Yeah, he said, his focus returning to his drawing. It's what I picture when I think about home. A place where it's always warm and everyone belongs. Eleanor felt a pang in her chest. She reached out, touching the edge of his paper gently. It's a wonderful dream, she said softly, and I think you're closer to it than you realize. Ollie paused, his pencil hovering over the page. Do you think so? He asked, glancing up at her. I do, she said, her voice steady. Sometimes, dreams start small, but with the right people, they grow into something real. Ollie studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded and returned to his work, his lips curving into the faintest smile. As the afternoon unfolded, Eleanor stayed with the children, helping them with their projects and listening to their stories. Mia insisted on painting Eleanor's nails with glitter polish, and though it left her hands a mess, Eleanor didn't mind. The laughter they shared felt like a gift in itself, a reminder of the joy she had been missing for so long. Later, after the children had gone to play outside, Eleanor stayed behind to help Mrs. Foster clean up the art room. They worked in companionable silence for a while before Mrs. Foster spoke. "You've come a long way, Eleanor," she said, her tone thoughtful. "I don't think I've ever seen the kids so attached to someone." Eleanor smiled faintly, wiping glitter off the table. "I've become attached to them too. More than I ever expected." Mrs. Foster set down the jar she was holding and looked at Eleanor. "You're doing a good thing, you know? But it's not just about them. It's about you too. I see it every time you're here. They've brought something out in you that you probably thought you'd lost." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded slowly. "They've reminded me of what's important. For so long, I thought success meant shutting out the world, focusing on work. But now, I realize how empty that was. Being with them, seeing their hope, it's changed everything." Mrs. Foster smiled. "That's the power of connection. It's messy and unpredictable, but it's worth it." The next few days were a blur of preparation and anticipation. Eleanor spent hours wrapping gifts, decorating her home, and completing the final steps of the guardianship process. She had never felt more uncertain or more determined. On Christmas Eve, Eleanor returned to the shelter for the holiday dinner. The children were dressed in their best clothes, their eyes wide with excitement as they gathered around the tree in the main hall. Eleanor brought a bag of presents, each one carefully labeled for the children she had come to know. When it was time for the gift exchange, Ollie and Mia were among the last to receive theirs. Eleanor handed Mia a box wrapped in shimmering gold paper, and the little girl tore into it with glee. Inside was a soft, pink quilt and a matching set of pajamas. Mia hugged the quilt tightly, her face glowing with joy. For Ollie, Eleanor had chosen a leather-bound journal with his initials engraved on the cover, along with a set of high-quality pencils. When he opened it, his eyes widened, and he looked up at her, speechless. "I thought you could use something special for your stories and drawings," Eleanor said gently. Ollie's voice was quiet but steady. "It's perfect. Thank you." The evening ended with carols and cocoa, the room filled with warmth and laughter. As Eleanor prepared to leave, Ollie approached her, holding the journal close. "Miss Eleanor," he said, his tone serious. "Is it true? Are we going to live with you?" Eleanor knelt down so they were eye to eye. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "If that's what you want, then yes." Ollie didn't hesitate. He threw his arms around her, holding on tightly. "It's what we want," he whispered. Eleanor hugged him back, tears pricking her eyes. In that moment, she knew that no matter how challenging the road ahead might be, it was a journey she was ready to take, with them and for them. This was her second chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. Christmas morning dawned crisp and bright, the snow from the previous night shimmering in the early sunlight. Eleanor's home, for the first time in years, felt alive. The tree in the living room glowed with soft white lights, its branches heavy with ornaments she'd carefully selected the week before. The scent of pine mingled with the warm aroma of cinnamon rolls baking in the oven, a recipe she tried at the insistence of Janine, who had sent it to her along with a note. "You're doing something amazing. This will make it feel like home." Mia was the first to wake, her small feet padding softly across the wooden floors. She stopped at the base of the staircase, her eyes widening as she took in the room. The tree, the stockings hung by the fireplace, and the pile of gifts waiting to be unwrapped. It was everything she'd imagined Christmas should be. "Miss Eleanor," she called out, her voice echoing through the house. "Ollie, wake up. Santa came." Eleanor emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, just as Ollie appeared at the top of the stairs. His hair was rumpled from sleep, but his eyes lit up when he saw the scene below. Slowly, he descended the stairs, Mia rushing ahead of him to inspect the presents. "You didn't have to do all this," Ollie said softly, his gaze shifting to Eleanor. "I wanted to," Eleanor replied. "This is your home now, and it's Christmas. It should be special." Mia was already tearing into her first gift, a box of art supplies with paints, brushes, and glitter pens. She squealed with delight and immediately began planning what she would create. Ollie approached the tree more cautiously, picking up a small package labeled with his name. He opened it to reveal a set of books Eleanor had carefully chosen, adventure stories and novels about young heroes finding their way in the world. "These are amazing," he said, his voice filled with quiet awe. "Thank you." As the morning unfolded, laughter and conversation filled the room. Eleanor found herself marveling at how natural it all felt. This simple act of sharing a holiday with people she cared about. For so long, she'd avoided anything that required emotional investment, but now, surrounded by Ollie and Mia, she wondered how she'd ever convinced herself that isolation was the answer. Later, as they sat around the dining table eating breakfast, Mia looked up from her plate. "This is the best Christmas ever," she declared, her tone decisive. Ollie nodded in agreement, a rare but genuine smile on his face. "Yeah, it is." Eleanor felt a lump rise in her throat. She'd spent years building a life of material success, but none of it had ever brought her this kind of fulfillment. Watching the children's joy, she realized that this, being here, creating a home for them, was what she had been missing. After breakfast, they bundled up and ventured outside. The snow in the yard was pristine, untouched except for the faint tracks of birds and squirrels. Mia immediately began gathering snow for a snowman, enlisting Eleanor's help to roll the base. Ollie, ever the planner, sketched a quick diagram in the snow to map out their design. For hours, they worked together, laughing and teasing each other as they built not just one snowman, but an entire snow family. Eleanor found herself on her hands and knees, sculpting a snow dog under Mia's watchful eye. By the time they finished, her gloves were soaked, and her cheeks ached from smiling. "This one's you," Mia said, pointing to a small snowman with a scarf and a crooked smile. "Because you make everything better." Eleanor's breath caught. She crouched down, brushing snow from Mia's cheek. "You make everything better too," she said. "Both of you." Ollie watched quietly from a few feet away, his expression thoughtful. Eleanor noticed and held out her hand to him. He hesitated, then stepped closer, allowing her to pull him into a gentle hug. The warmth of that moment stayed with Eleanor throughout the day. When the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow-covered lawn, the three of them retreated inside, their faces flushed and their spirits high. They spent the evening curled up on the couch, sipping hot cocoa and watching old Christmas movies. Mia fell asleep first, her head resting against Eleanor's shoulder. Ollie stayed awake longer, his gaze fixed on the screen, though Eleanor suspected his thoughts were elsewhere. As the credits rolled, Ollie finally spoke. "Do you think it's okay to stop wishing for something once you have it?" he asked quietly. Eleanor looked at him, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. "I think it's okay to let yourself enjoy what you have," she said gently. "But it's also okay to keep dreaming. Dreams don't have to stop." Ollie nodded slowly, as if weighing her words. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "A home. A real Christmas. You deserve it," Eleanor said firmly. "You and Mia both. And I'm so glad I get to share it with you." Ollie looked at her then, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and something deeper. Trust, perhaps, or the beginnings of a bond he hadn't allowed himself to hope for before. "Thank you," he said simply. As Eleanor tucked both children into bed that night, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Her life, once so rigid and solitary, had been transformed by two remarkable children who had reminded her of what it meant to love and to hope. She didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but she felt ready to face them, with Ollie and Mia by her side. Standing by the window in her bedroom, Eleanor looked out at the snow-covered landscape, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. For the first time in years, she saw not just a successful businesswoman, but someone who had rediscovered what truly mattered. She thought of William, her long-lost brother, and felt a quiet resolve. This time, she wouldn't fail. This time, she would hold on. As the clock struck midnight, signaling the end of Christmas Day, Eleanor whispered into the quiet room, "Merry Christmas, William. I hope you found your peace too." The days after Christmas were a mix of quiet joy and growing adjustment. Eleanor worked to establish routines for Ollie and Mia in her home, balancing the novelty of their new lives with the need for structure. Mornings were filled with the clatter of breakfast dishes, the occasional spill of juice, and Mia's constant chatter about what she planned to draw that day. Ollie was quieter, more reserved, but there was a calmness to him now, as if the weight he'd carried for so long was beginning to lift. Eleanor found herself marveling at how quickly her once quiet house had transformed into a place of laughter and warmth. Every room seemed brighter, every corner filled with life. And yet, as she watched Ollie and Mia settle in, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to do, more to understand about their past and about her own. One evening, as the children were playing in the living room, Eleanor sat in her study, flipping through old photo albums. She hadn't opened them in years, but now, with Ollie and Mia in her life, she felt a pull toward the memories they held. Page after page revealed glimpses of her childhood. Holidays with her parents, birthday parties with friends, and, most poignant of all, moments with her younger brother, William. She paused on a photo of the two of them at a park. William was about Ollie's age, grinning as he held up a kite that had just taken flight. Eleanor remembered that day vividly. How proud William had been, how he'd begged her to take a picture so he could remember it forever. The memory brought a lump to her throat. She had failed to protect him, to keep their family together, and the guilt had followed her ever since. But now, with Ollie and Mia, she felt a glimmer of redemption. Perhaps she couldn't change the past, but she could shape the future, for them and for herself. The next day, Eleanor decided to take Ollie and Mia to the town library. It was a crisp winter morning, the streets still dusted with snow from a light flurry the night before. Mia skipped ahead, her mittened hands flailing as she pointed out snowflakes and icicles. Ollie walked beside Eleanor, his gaze steady but thoughtful. "Do you like books?" Eleanor asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Ollie nodded. "I like stories, ones with adventures and happy endings." Eleanor smiled. "Those are my favorite too." At the library, Mia immediately gravitated toward the children's section, where a volunteer was leading a storytime session. Eleanor watched as the little girl settled onto a carpet square, her face glowing with excitement. Ollie, meanwhile, wandered toward a shelf lined with novels and biographies. Eleanor followed him, her curiosity piqued. "Find anything interesting?" she asked. Ollie pulled out a book about explorers and held it up. "I like learning about people who went places no one else had been. It's kind of like starting over." Eleanor studied him, her heart aching at the wisdom in his words. "That's a brave thing to do," she said. "Starting over." Ollie shrugged, but there was a hint of pride in his expression. "Sometimes you don't have a choice. You just have to keep going." They checked out a small stack of books and spent the rest of the morning exploring the town. Eleanor introduced them to her favorite cafe, where Mia devoured a frosted cupcake and Ollie quietly savored a cup of hot chocolate. She couldn't help but notice how much more relaxed they seemed, their guarded edges softening with each passing day. But later that evening, as they sat together in the living room, Ollie's thoughtful silence returned. He was sketching in his new journal, his pencil moving with precision, when he suddenly looked up. "Miss Eleanor," he began, his voice steady but tentative. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," Eleanor said, setting down her tea. "Anything." Ollie hesitated, his fingers tightening around the pencil. "Do you think my mom will ever come back?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken fears. Eleanor took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I don't know, Ollie," she said honestly, "but I do know that she loves you and Mia very much. And whatever happens, you have a home here. Always." Ollie nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to his journal. "It's just, I don't remember her very well anymore. Sometimes, I think maybe she forgot about us." Eleanor's chest tightened. She reached out, placing a hand on his. "I don't think she forgot you, Ollie, and it's okay to miss her. But it's also okay to let yourself be happy here. You don't have to feel guilty for that." Ollie looked up at her, his eyes shimmering with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "Thank you," he said quietly. That night, as Eleanor tucked Mia into bed, The little girl reached out and touched her cheek. "Miss Eleanor," Mia said sleepily, "you're like our mom now." Eleanor's breath caught. She leaned down, brushing a strand of hair from Mia's forehead. "I'm here for you," she whispered. "Always." As she closed the door to Mia's room, she found Ollie waiting in the hallway. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. He hugged her then, quick but fierce, and for the first time, Eleanor felt the weight of his trust. In her own room, Eleanor sat by the window, staring out at the snowy landscape. She thought about how far they had come in such a short time and how much further there was to go. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel afraid. Instead, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. As she drifted off to sleep, she dreamed of William, his smile as bright as it had been in the old photograph. He stood beside a castle much like the one Ollie often drew, his voice echoing in the distance. "You're doing the right thing, Eleanor. Keep going." When she woke the next morning, the dream lingered, filling her with a quiet resolve. She didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't alone anymore. And neither were Ollie and Mia. Snow continued to fall gently over Winterridge as New Year's approached, covering the town in a pristine blanket of white. Eleanor's home, once cold and impersonal, now radiated warmth. Every room seemed to echo with the sounds of life. Mia's laughter as she chased their new rescue dog around the kitchen, Ollie's quiet focus as he worked on his sketches, the clinking of mugs and plates as Eleanor prepared breakfast for the three of them. On this particular morning, Eleanor was busy at the stove, flipping pancakes as Mia chattered about her latest masterpiece. Ollie sat at the kitchen table, his journal open in front of him. He wasn't drawing today, but writing, his pencil moving deliberately across the page. "What are you working on, Ollie?" Eleanor asked, setting a plate of pancakes on the table. "Just a story," he said, not looking up. "It's about starting over." Mia, perched on her chair with syrup already smeared on her fingers, leaned over to peek at his work. "Is it about us?" she asked, her eyes wide. "Kind of," Ollie admitted, his cheeks flushing. "But it's also about family and finding home." Eleanor felt her heart swell. She sat down beside him, her voice soft. "I'd love to read it someday, if you're ready to share." "Maybe," Ollie said with a small smile. "It's not finished yet." As they ate, the doorbell rang, an unusual occurrence in their quiet neighborhood. Eleanor wiped her hands on a towel and went to answer it, her mind racing with possibilities. When she opened the door, she found Rachel standing on the porch, bundled in a heavy coat, her face half hidden beneath a scarf. "Rachel," Eleanor said, her voice catching with surprise. "You're here." Rachel pulled the scarf from her face, her expression hesitant but hopeful. "I wanted to meet them, if that's okay." Eleanor stepped aside, her heart pounding as she gestured for her daughter to come in. "Of course. They'll be thrilled." Inside, Ollie and Mia looked up from their breakfast as Rachel entered the room. Eleanor introduced them, her voice steady despite the rush of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "This is Rachel," she said. "She's my daughter." Mia's eyes widened. "You're her kid?" she asked, her tone filled with wonder. "I am," Rachel said, smiling. "And I've heard a lot about you too." Ollie nodded, his gaze cautious but curious. "Are you staying for breakfast?" "If that's okay," Rachel replied, glancing at Eleanor for confirmation. Eleanor smiled. "It's more than okay. I'll grab another plate." As they sat together, the initial tension melted away. Rachel asked Ollie about his drawings, listened intently as Mia described her latest painting, and even joined in their lively debate over which holiday movie was the best. Eleanor watched with quiet gratitude as her daughter began to connect with the children who had become such a vital part of her life. After breakfast, the four of them ventured outside to enjoy the snow. Mia led the charge, pulling Rachel into a snowball fight that left them both laughing and breathless. Ollie stayed closer to Eleanor, helping her build a snow fort while the others ran circles around them. "Do you think Rachel likes us?" Ollie asked suddenly, his voice barely audible over the crunch of snow beneath their boots. Eleanor paused, looking at him. "I think she more than likes you," she said. "I think she's already proud of you. Just like I am." Ollie's expression softened, and for a moment, he looked like the carefree boy he was meant to be. "I'm glad she came," he said simply. By the time they returned inside, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-covered yard. Rachel helped Mia hang her wet mittens to dry, while Eleanor prepared hot cocoa for everyone. They gathered in the living room, the fire crackling softly as they settled onto the couch. Rachel turned to Eleanor, her voice quiet but firm. "You've done something incredible here, Mom. I can see how much they mean to you." Eleanor met her daughter's gaze, her own eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "They've given me as much as I've given them," she said. "Maybe more." Rachel nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I think William would have been proud of you too." The mention of William brought a wave of emotion, but instead of sadness, Eleanor felt a deep sense of peace. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that she had honored his memory, not just by remembering him, but by creating something beautiful in his absence. That night, after Rachel had returned to her hotel and Mia was fast asleep, Ollie approached Eleanor in the living room. He held his journal in his hands, his expression hesitant. "I want you to read it," he said, holding the journal out to her. "The story I've been working on." Eleanor took the journal carefully, her heart pounding as she opened it. The story was written in neat, deliberate handwriting, each word chosen with care. It told the tale of two siblings who had lost their way, only to find themselves again through the kindness of a stranger. The final lines read, "And in the end, they learned that home wasn't a place, but the people who stayed by your side, no matter what." When Eleanor looked up, her eyes filled with tears, Ollie was watching her intently. "Do you like it?" he asked. "I love it," she said, her voice trembling. "It's beautiful, Ollie. Just like you." Ollie smiled, and in that moment, Eleanor saw the walls he had built around himself finally begin to crumble. He leaned forward and hugged her tightly, and she held him close, her heart full. As the year came to a close, Eleanor found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed. She had started the season as a woman closed off from the world, but now she was part of a family. A real, imperfect, wonderful family. And for the first time in years, she felt whole. As the clock struck midnight on New Year's Eve, Eleanor stood at the window, watching the snow fall. Ollie and Mia were asleep upstairs, and the house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock. She thought of William, of Rachel, of the journey that had brought her here, and she whispered into the stillness, "Thank you." It wasn't just a thank you for the past or for the people she had lost. It was for the future she had found, one filled with love, hope, and the family she had never expected but always needed.